All right, ready to dive deep into something I know you've been asking about, child support in the U.S.
I'm ready.
We're going to get granular today, going deep with a report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, a National Library of Medicine research study, and an article from the Center for American Progress. Get ready for some aha moments.
Oh, yeah.
This is a seriously complex topic with a fascinating history and a whole lot of debate swirling around it.
It certainly is. A lot more to it than just dollars and cents. It's about the well-being of families.
Okay, before we go too deep, can you give us a working definition of child support? What are we even talking about here?
The Annie E. Casey Foundation kind of puts it like this. Payments made to help cover the cost of raising a child after parents split, whether it's divorce or separation. It's usually ongoing, and it's typically the parent who spends less time with the child that pays.
And that's kind of where it starts to get interesting, right? Because it's not always about straight up cash. The Casey Foundation report mentioned things like groceries, clothes, medical bills can all count too. So it really adds another layer to how we even define support.
Absolutely. It's about contributing to a child's well-being, not just a financial transaction.
The history of child support in the U.S. is wild. I had no idea how much things have changed.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about the early 1900s. Back then, it was usually the fathers getting custody in divorce cases.
Really?
Yeah, a different world. Men were often the sole breadwinners, and divorce itself was much less common.
So what happened? Why did things swing towards mothers?
I think several factors were at play. Women were gaining more independence, entering the workforce, and the courts started to reflect that change. But then there's this fascinating thing called the tender years doctrine that came up around the mid-20th century.
Tender years doctrine.
Yeah.
Now, there's a phrase you don't hear every day.
Right.
What's that all about?
The idea was that young children, especially in their early years, were better off with their mothers. Mothers were seen as inherently more nurturing and better equipped to handle those emotional needs.
I can see that. But seems like that could perpetuate some assumptions about gender roles.
It did. And while all of this was happening, you had key legislation like the Social Security Act of 1935, which introduced aid for single mothers. These changes solidified the idea that fathers had a financial responsibility, even after separation. Then, probably the biggest change, the Child Support Enforcement Act of 1975.
Sounds like a big one.
Huge. It created these state agencies specifically to enforce child support orders, gave them real power. They could garnish wages, seize assets, really hold non-custodial parents accountable.
And I think statistically a lot of those non-custodial parents end up being fathers, right?
That's right.
I think this is a good place to tackle the question that's on everyone's mind. Why do men usually end up paying child support more than women? What's the deal?
There's a lot going on here, and I think our sources offer some helpful insights. We've already touched on how custody laws evolved historically. Even though things are getting more gender neutral in family courts, mothers still get primary custody in the vast majority of cases, probably 80 to 85%, according to some estimates.
Wow. So is that the whole picture? Just those historical trends, or are there other things at play?
Well, it's complicated. The Center for American Progress article talks about that deadbeat dad image that was everywhere in the 90s, driven by media and political rhetoric, definitely impacted public perception, maybe even legal decisions.
That classic image of the dad who walks out and just doesn't care.
Right.
But that can't be the whole story.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
It's never that simple, and that stereotype definitely doesn't represent all fathers. There's all kinds of reasons some dads struggle with child support obligations, but the fact remains that mothers are still awarded custody more often. And on top of that, there's the earnings disparity between men and women.
So it sets up this expectation that the man is the primary earner. So he's the one who's going to pay, even if it's more nuanced than that.
You got it. We can't ignore the influence of traditional gender roles. Things are changing, but those expectations are still around and can definitely affect how courts view a parent's responsibility.
So, like, historical baggage, societal pressures, and economic realities all mixed together.
You said it.
Okay, now let's get real about how this impacts men. What does the research say?
Both the Casey Foundation report and that National Library of Medicine study looked into this. On a practical level, there's definitely financial strain. Men are often paying a huge amount of their income, anywhere from 20% to 50%, on child support.
Yeah, that's not insignificant, especially if you're dealing with job insecurity or already struggling.
Right. And if they fall behind on payments, there's this whole cascade of consequences. Wage garnishment, driver's license suspension, even jail time in some cases.
Jail time.
It can happen. Raises some serious questions about whether that's an effective or fair approach. But even beyond the financial and legal consequences, there's the emotional toll. Many men say they feel alienated from their children because of the child support system, like they're reduced to an ATM, and their involvement hinges on payments.
It's like pay to play, financially obligated, but emotionally shut out.
It's rough. And that feeling of being pushed aside can be devastating. Studies have shown a link between divorce, child support battles, and higher rates of depression, even suicide among fathers.
That's heartbreaking, really shows that this is way more than a legal or financial matter. It's about people's lives. What about the bigger picture? How does this affect society as a whole?
Well, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly side to the child support system. Let's start with the good. Why do we even have this system?
Because at the end of the day, it's about protecting kids, right?
Absolutely. Child support is crucial for providing stability for children when their parents split. Make sure they have essentials: housing, food, healthcare, education. And it can reduce the need for welfare programs. So it acts like a safety net, protecting kids and supporting families.
Okay, that makes sense. But you mentioned a bad side.
Well, the system as it stands can lead to some unfair outcomes, particularly for non-custodial fathers. You have situations where a dad is making a genuine effort to be involved in his child's life, but he's still slammed with a huge child support order, often without equal parental rights.
So it creates a power imbalance where the custodial parent, often the mother, has more control, and the non-custodial parent, often the father, is just the financial provider.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's the cases where high-income fathers are ordered to pay tons of money, even if the mother is doing well financially. It doesn't always feel tailored to each situation. Can lead to resentment.
Starts to feel less like support and more like punishment,
That's it.
and the ugly side.
Well, we've already touched on those harsh enforcement measures, like jail time. Makes it even harder to earn money and meet obligations. And those mental health consequences we mentioned. The Center for American Progress article even cited statistics showing a significantly higher suicide rate among divorced fathers who went through brutal child support battles. Really a dark side to the system.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just about numbers, it's about real people and their lives. But at the end of the day, does child support actually benefit the children it's designed to protect?
$1 million question.
Yeah.
It's exactly what that National Library of Medicine research dug into. It's interesting, they looked at both formal child support payments ordered by the court and informal support. Cash gifts, directly paying for expenses. They wanted to see how both types affected kids.
Interesting.
What they found is fascinating. Informal support, especially in larger amounts, was linked to higher cognitive scores in children.
So like kids whose fathers were contributing even outside the formal system were doing better.
Right. It shows that having that extra financial help can make a real difference.
What about the formal child support?
Here's where it gets tricky. They actually found a possible link between formal child support payments and more behavioral problems in children.
Really?
Yeah.
That does make sense.
It's really important to remember this. Correlation doesn't equal causation. They weren't saying the payments caused these problems, but they did offer some explanations. Like going through a formal case can be stressful and create instability, even if it does lead to financial support. Could also be that the parental conflict surrounding child support is what's impacting the child negatively.
So it might not be the child support itself, but the stuff that comes along with it.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is to think about how parental separation affects kids emotionally. Not just about the money. It's about creating a loving and stable environment.
So research is saying that while money is essential, it's not the only thing that matters.
You get it?
Okay, so we've looked at the history, why men pay more often, the impact on men and children, and all these different factors. What about solutions? What can we do to make things fairer and more effective? Where do we go from here?
That's the question, isn't it? Luckily, there are a lot of ideas out there. That Center for American Progress article lays out a few of them. One that's gotten some traction is the concept of shared custody as the default.
Shared custody. So instead of assuming the mother gets custody, we assume both parents share custody equally, unless there's a reason not to.
That's the idea. The argument is that it creates a more equitable starting point, encourages both parents to be involved from the beginning.
I can see that, but that would be controversial, right? People would argue that puts children at risk if one parent is unfit.
Of course. There would need to be safeguards to protect kids in those situations. No one's saying to force it in every single case. It's about changing the initial assumptions. Instead of automatically favoring the mother, both parents have to show they're committed to the child's well-being.
So more of a collaborative approach, even when the romantic relationship is over.
Exactly.
What about the money side of things? How would shared custody change child support payments?
Well, in true shared custody, where time and responsibilities are truly equal, you might not even need child support payments. Or they could be much lower, with each parent contributing based on their income.
So we'd have to rethink how child support is calculated.
Totally. It's about moving away from one parent being solely responsible and recognizing that it's shared.
We talked about making child support income-based and adaptable before. What would that look like in practice?
So right now, child support is often based on a snapshot of someone's income at a specific time. But incomes change all the time. People lose jobs, get promotions, have unexpected expenses.
And the current system doesn't really keep up with those changes.
Right, so you might have a dad making good money when child support is ordered, then he loses his job or takes a pay cut. Suddenly he's struggling to make payments, which leads to those harsh consequences we talked about.
Wage garnishment, license suspension. It's like a spiral.
Exactly. Income-based adjustments are about making the system more flexible and responsive, acknowledging that financial situations can change, and adjusting payments.
No, like regular reviews of both parents' incomes and then adjusting accordingly.
It could be that. There are a few ideas out there. Some suggest automatically linking adjustments to things like tax returns or employment records. Others propose a system where either parent can request a review if their financial situation changes significantly.
Sounds like a lot of administrative work.
It would be. But a lot of people say it's worth it to create a system that's actually fair and reflects real life.
Okay, so we've got shared custody, income-based adjustments. What else is on the table?
Increasing transparency and accountability in how those funds are actually being used. We've touched on the lack of trust in the system. A lot of non-custodial parents feel like they're in the dark about how their money is being spent.
Right, that just creates more conflict between parents.
Exactly. So there are solutions to make child support payments more transparent and trackable. Imagine a system where there's a clear record of how the money is being used that both parents can see. Others want clearer guidelines about what counts as a legitimate expense for a child, so everyone is on the same page.
More openness, less conflict.
Exactly.
What else?
One that's been getting a lot of attention is eliminating jail time for not paying child support.
We talked about that a bit. I'm on board with that. Makes no sense to jail someone who's already struggling financially.
It often does more harm than good. So a lot of people are pushing for alternatives that focus on rehabilitation and support.
What would that look like?
Well, some states are trying programs that offer things like job training, financial counseling, to help these parents get back on their feet.
Helping them get to a place where they can provide for their child.
Exactly. It's a more humane and effective approach.
Recognizes that these fathers want to support their kids. They just might need a little help.
Yeah. And that kind of supportive environment can lead to better outcomes for everyone.
The father, the mother, and most importantly, the child.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got shared custody, income-based adjustments, more transparency, ditching jail time. These all seem like good steps towards a better system. But are we seeing any action at the federal level to make this happen?
It's slow going, as you can imagine. But there have been some attempts. One example is the Obama administration's final rule from the Office of Child Support Enforcement back in 2016.
What did that do?
It was a good step. It required states to really consider a non-custodial parent's ability to pay when setting child support. It also encouraged states to look at alternatives to jail time and to create policies that allow modifications of child support orders for incarcerated parents.
Sounds like a move toward a more fair system.
It was. But as the Center for American Progress article pointed out, it didn't go far enough. A lot of states still rely on those punishments, and the whole system still has some major problems.
There's still work to be done. Any states leading the way with reforms?
There are a few. Some are experimenting with programs that offer job training and placement services, specifically for non-custodial parents.
That's interesting. Are they working?
Early signs are good. Studies are finding these programs can lead to higher earnings, more consistent payments, and even improved attitudes towards the system.
Win-win-win.
It really highlights that investing in supportive services for fathers is beneficial for everyone.
The fathers, the mothers, the children. Makes sense. If you help a father be financially stable, he's more likely to be able to contribute.
Exactly. Financially and emotionally.
But these programs need funding. Where's that coming from?
It's a big question. Some states are using federal and state funds. Others are getting creative, partnering with private organizations, using a portion of child support collections to fund these services.
Not an easy fix. But it seems like people are realizing that finding ways to make this happen is important.
Definitely. It's an investment in families and children.
Okay, so we've got the historical context, the reasons behind the disparity in payments, the impact on men and children, and some potential solutions. What stands out to you most?
How this one issue connects to so many things. Gender roles, economic disparities, the legal system, and of course, the well-being of families and children.
And we've seen that it's about so much more than money.
Definitely. The current system, with all the enforcement and punishment, often ends up hurting the relationships it's supposed to protect.
If we were to completely reimagine child support, what would that look like?
I think it needs a new perspective, moving away from it being just about money and viewing it as a chance to create healthy family dynamics and positive parental involvement.
Not just about the dollars and cents, it's about that father-child bond.
That's right. And while financial stability is important, it's not the only thing.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, I think it means prioritizing shared custody when it's safe. It means making the system for payments more flexible, offering more support services for fathers, like job training, financial counseling, legal guidance, moving away from the us versus them, and creating a system where both parents can be involved in their child's life.
And at the end of the day, it's not about father's rights or mother's rights. It's about doing what's best for the child.
Well said.
All right, listeners, that's a lot to think about for now. When we come back, we'll be breaking down some of the biggest myths and misconceptions about child support and looking at some real-world examples. Stay with us.
That last part really got me thinking, especially about that research showing that informal support from fathers, like directly covering expenses, was linked to higher cognitive scores for kids. Makes you wonder if encouraging more of that, direct involvement could be more beneficial in some cases. It's a great point. And it's something researchers are digging into more and more. There's definitely evidence that informal support, when it's consistent, can be amazing for kids, and it often goes way beyond money. Think about spending time with your kid, emotional support, just being there for them.
So it's not just about the money, it's about that father-child bond.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And remember, the formal system wasn't created to replace that parental involvement. It was meant to be a safety net, making sure kids were supported even when their parents weren't together.
But it feels like somewhere along the way the focus shifted, more about enforcing payments and less about those relationships.
I think so. And that's why so many of the reforms we talked about are trying to bring back that focus on the child overall well-being, encouraging both parents to be involved.
Let's talk more about some of those solutions. You mentioned shared custody as the default. What would that actually look like?
Basically, unless there's evidence of abuse or neglect or some other serious concern, courts would automatically grant both parents equal custody.
So instead of these big custody battles, which can be so damaging, we start from the assumption that both parents share the responsibility.
Yeah. It's acknowledging that both parents have a right to be in their child's life. And most of the time, kids benefit from having both parents around.
That makes sense, but I bet it would be controversial.
Oh, for sure.
Some people would worry that it puts kids at risk.
Of course, there would have to be safeguards. It's not about forcing shared custody in every single case. It's about changing how we start the conversation. Instead of automatically favoring the mother, both parents have to show they're committed to their child.
More collaborative, even when the romance is over.
That's it.
So what about the money? How would shared custody change child support?
Well, if you have true shared custody where everything is split equally, you might not even need child support, or it could be way less. Both parents contributing based on what they make.
So the whole calculation changes.
You would have to. It's about moving away from this idea that one parent is responsible for everything, recognizing that it's shared.
Which brings us to that other reform. Income-based, adaptable child support payments. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, right now payments are based on how much a parent makes at a specific time. But we all know incomes change.
Yeah, people lose jobs, get promotions, unexpected bills pop up.
Right. Life happens. And the system doesn't always keep up with that. So you might have a dad who's doing well when the order is made. Then he loses his job or has to take a pay cut. And he's stuck trying to make these payments he can't afford, which is how those harsh punishments happen.
It's a tough cycle to break.
It is. Income-based adjustments are about being flexible, taking those real-life changes into account.
So like regular reviews of both parents' incomes and then adjusting the payments up or down.
Could be. There are a few ideas floating around. Some want it linked to tax returns or employment records, so it happens automatically. Others say either parent should be able to ask for a review if things change a lot.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It would be a lot of work. But a lot of people think it's crucial to make the system truly fair.
Okay, we've talked shared custody and income-based adjustments. Anything else?
Well, another big one is more transparency and accountability in how those funds are being used. A lot of non-custodial parents feel like they're just writing a blank check.
Yeah.
No idea where the money's going. And that breeds a lot of distrust and conflict,
Hmm.
which isn't good for anyone, especially the child.
Right.
So there are solutions to make child support payments more transparent, like
Hmm.
having a clear record of where the money goes that both parents see, or having clear guidelines for what counts as a legitimate expense. It's about getting everyone on the same page.
More communication, less conflict.
That's the goal.
What else?
The big one that's gaining traction is ending jail time for non-payment.
We talked about that before. I'm totally for it. It's just counterproductive.
It is. So people are pushing for alternatives, like rehabilitation and support
Mm.
instead of punishment.
What would that look like?
Some states are trying out programs that provide job training, financial counseling, things like that, helping these parents get back on their feet.
Giving them the tools to support their kids.
Exactly. It's a much more humane and effective approach.
Recognizing that a lot of these dads want to be there for their kids, they just might need some help.
Exactly. And that kind of support can lead to better outcomes for everyone involved.
So are we seeing any of these reforms happening at the federal level? Or is it all just talk?
Well, there have been some attempts, but it's slow going. One example is the Obama administration's final rule from the Office of Child Support Enforcement back in 2016.
What did that do?
It was a step in the right direction. It said states need to really look at a non-custodial parent's ability to pay when they're setting the amount. It also pushed for alternatives to jail time and for making it easier to change child support orders for parents who are incarcerated.
So a positive step?
It was. But as the Center for American Progress pointed out, it wasn't enough. A lot of states still use those harsh punishments, and the whole system needs some work.
So there's still a long way to go. Any states out there that are doing things differently?
Yeah, a few. Some are testing out these programs that offer job training and placement services, specifically for non-custodial parents.
Interesting. Are they working?
Early data suggests they are.
Mm.
They seem to be leading to higher earnings for these dads, more consistent child support payments, and a better attitude towards the system overall.
So everyone benefits.
Exactly. It really highlights the fact that investing in support for fathers is a good thing.
For them, for the mothers, and especially for the kids. Makes sense. If you help a father be more stable, he's more likely to be able to contribute,
That's right.
both financially and emotionally. But these programs cost money. Where's the funding coming from?
It's a big question. Some states are using a mix of federal and state money. Some are being creative, partnering with private groups, using some of the child support money to fund these services.
It's a complex issue, but the important thing is that people are starting to realize these programs are worth funding.
I agree. It's an investment in families and in the future.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the reasons behind the payment differences, the impact on everyone involved, and some possible solutions. What's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think it's realizing that this is so much more than a legal or financial issue. It's about societal expectations, economic reality, how families work. It's about recognizing that child support isn't just about money. It's about children and their right to have both parents involved in their
Oh,
lives.
well said. It feels like we're at a turning point in this conversation,
I think so.
moving away from those oversimplified ideas and starting to really understand how complex this is.
I hope so. And I hope that leads to real changes, changes that put kids first and create a system that's fair for everyone.
Okay, listeners, that's a lot to digest. When we come back, we'll be tackling some of the most common myths about child support and looking at some examples of how this all plays out in real life. Stay with us. We're back for the last part of our deep dive on child support. You know, one thing that really hit me while we were prepping for this is just how many myths and misconceptions people have about this whole thing. It seems like everyone's got an opinion, but they're not always based in reality.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Sometimes it's personal experience or isolated incidents that get blown out of proportion. Sometimes it's even tied to political agendas. It can be tough to sort through it all.
It is, and it's easy to get caught up in the emotional side of things, especially when you hear stories about fathers being treated unfairly or mothers struggling to make ends meet.
Right, you hear those stories, and it's natural to feel for those people. But when we're talking about something as complicated as child support, we have to step back and be objective. Look at the data, the research, the way the system actually works, not just those anecdotes.
Okay, so let's bust some myths. One I hear all the time is that mothers always get custody and fathers are always stuck paying. Is there any truth to that?
Well, statistically, mothers are more likely to be awarded custody. We talked about those numbers, something like 80 to 85%.
Yeah.
But it's not a guarantee. Courts are trying to be more gender neutral, and there are definitely cases where fathers get custody, especially if they can show it's best for the child.
So it's not as simple as some people make it sound.
Not at all. Family law is rarely black and white. Every case is different, and judges are supposed to consider all sorts of things when they're making custody decisions.
What about that idea that mothers misuse child support money? That one comes up a lot.
Yeah, you hear it. There have been some high-profile cases that make people think that's true, but those are just individual examples. They don't represent the whole picture. There's no evidence that mothers are misusing child support money on a large scale.
Like any system, there will be a few bad apples.
Yeah, exactly.
But that doesn't mean the system is broken.
Right. And a lot of states have actually put things in place to try to prevent misuse. Some require custodial parents to show how they're using the money, especially if there are concerns.
So there are some checks and balances.
There are. And it's important to talk about those safeguards because that myth about misuse often feeds into this bigger idea that the whole system is biased against fathers.
It's used to justify not paying or to make mothers look bad.
Exactly. And that kind of talk is really damaging. It creates a lot of distrust and animosity, which just hurts the child in the end.
Okay, so we've busted the myth that mothers always get custody and that they're misusing the money. What else do people get wrong?
Another big one is that child support payments are always crazy high, designed to punish the father.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
It all depends. Like most things with child support, the amount someone has to pay is decided by a formula, and that formula is different in every state.
No easy answers.
Right. But in most cases, that formula considers both parents' incomes, how many kids there are, childcare costs, and other expenses. The goal is to make sure the child can live as close as possible to the way they would have if their parents were still together.
So it's about supporting the child, not punishing the parent.
Exactly. Now, there are situations where the payments can seem really high, especially if one parent makes a lot more money than the other.
But that's often because the child is used to a certain lifestyle. And the court is trying to keep things consistent.
Often, yeah. And remember, child support isn't just food and a roof over their head. It can be things like after-school activities, school costs, medical bills that insurance doesn't cover.
So it's really about taking care of the child and making the transition as smooth as possible.
Right. Now, we can definitely have a discussion about those formulas and whether they're always fair. But the idea is to take care of the child's needs, not to punish anyone.
Okay, so those are some of the big myths. But it's helpful to look at some real-world examples. Can you share some stories where the system worked well and maybe somewhere it didn't?
I can. Let's start with a good one. I read about this father who had to pay child support after a really tough divorce. At first, he was angry, felt like the system was against him. But then he decided to change his thinking. He realized that even though his marriage was over, he was still a dad. So he did more than just pay. He went to school events, helped with homework, spent time with his kid every week. And over time, his relationship with his ex-wife actually got better. They learned to co-parent, and their child was thriving.
That's a great example of taking something negative and turning it into a positive.
It shows that even though child support can be tough, it doesn't have to be a constant battle. It's about focusing on what the child needs and letting go of the anger.
Okay, that's a good one. What about one that didn't go so well?
Unfortunately, there are plenty of those too. I read about this dad who lost his job and couldn't keep up with his payments. He tried to do the right thing, called the court, explained the situation, asked for the payments to be changed, but it was a nightmare. No one answered his calls, paperwork got lost, and he ended up facing jail time because the system just didn't work.
That's a classic example of the system failing.
It is. It can be so inflexible. Sometimes it creates more problems than it solves.
Even if the system has good intentions, the way it actually works can sometimes have terrible consequences.
Absolutely. It shows how badly we need reform. We need a system that's fair and puts children first.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the world of child support. It's a complex issue, no doubt.
It is. And there are valid points on all sides.
I think the most important thing is to have this conversation with empathy and understanding, really wanting to find solutions that work for everyone.
I agree.
At the end of the day, it's about making sure children have both parents involved in their lives.
That's what matters.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and a huge thanks to our expert guest for all your insights.
It was my pleasure. It's always great to talk about something that's so important for families.
And to our listeners, keep exploring this issue. Don't be afraid to question your assumptions, and keep having these conversations about how we can create a better system for everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.